Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the Voice of Islam Living History Program. My name is Dr. Mohammed Iqbal and I'll be your host for the next hour or so talking about living history. As usual, we are joined by our panelist Arif Ahmad, a familiar person to you. Arif, welcome.
Assalamu alaikum, Dr.
And I'm absolutely delighted to introduce our new panelist on the Living History Program, Professor Amir Sharif. Professor Ahmad Sharif is Professor of Circular Economy at the University of Bradford, and he is also the Assistant Dean at the University of Bradford School of Management. So, Amir, welcome.
Assalamu alaikum.
Welcome, salam. It's great to have you as part of the team.
Thank you.
In today's program, we're going to talk about the rise of the Turks, and in particular the Seljuk Turks. In one of our previous programs, in fact, two programs, we talked about the great Ottoman Empire and their importance. So perhaps just a reminder, we will start from there. The Ottoman Empire was formed by Turkish tribes in Anatolia, Asia Minor, or Turkey, currently known as Turkey, around 1300 CE, and it grew to be one of the most powerful states in the world during the 15th and 16th centuries. The Ottoman period spanned more than 600 years, which is a lot longer than the Mughal Empire and the British Empire and the French empires as well. And it came to an end only in 1922 when it was replaced by the Turkish Republic. In the modern West, the Ottoman Empire is associated with just a few significant events, such as the fall of Constantinople in 1453. But as I said, the dynasty was quite amazing in what it achieved and how long it lasted. However, the Ottoman Turks were the sort of last of the great Turks. And in today's program, we're going to look at the origin of the Turks and look at another great Turk empire, the Seljuk Empire. And we're also going to look at the impact Islam had in converting the Turks who arose from the steppes, which we'll go into a lot more detail. And then, of course, the great Seljuk Empire. And after the demise, of course, there were some great dynasties from the Turks, the Mamluk dynasties. And again, we will discuss that in a bit more detail. So to start off then, let's start off with Amir, with trying to really understand where the Turks came from, like a bolt of lightning for mankind, wasn't it? Just take us through the origins, because they didn't come, Turkey was the last bit really where they ruled. Tell us where their origins were from.
No, absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Saab. And the great thing about this history is that we'll see, as you hear from all of us this afternoon, it's a great mixing of different cultures. So the origins of the Turks, like many other warrior people of that time, had their origins from Eurasia and the Eurasian steppes. And the Turks and their origins, of course, were based upon what we might call a horse culture. So they were nomads, and the ancestors of the Turks were very much nomadic tribesmen. So the domestication of the horse by these nomadic cultures was between 3,500 BCE and 6,000 BCE, a phenomenal range of history there, which gave them an edge over many other cultures. And because of that dependence upon the horse, but also upon their nomadic tribe culture, the reality was that the domestication of the horse into their culture was and became very advanced to allow them to use the horse in warfare and transportation, and also allowing them to develop their military skills. So things like them mounted archers over having dominance over foot soldiers, which led them to win many battles, as you'll hear. And that was very, very important, because when you combine that with very capable leaders, as we'll hear this afternoon, they became a very formidable force. So it's not unsurprising to understand that this 600-year history was literally a dominance in that part of the world. And sedentary civilizations, which were fixed in one place, could not really match them in many ways. And in terms of this horse culture, as I've talked about, they used to put their horses aside for breeding purposes or for agriculture, so that they weren't able to build up a cavalry force. But these the Turkish cultures, if you like, were based upon traveling, this idea of traveling and nomadic military superiority.
I mean, even before the Turks, the Scythians, I think, around the steppes area, central steppes, gave a hard time to some of the early empires in Mesopotamia and the Persians, etc. So they go way, way back. So they've played, as you say, and it was largely the use of the horse and associated military technologies as well. So just sort of looking at the origins of the Turks who came into Central Asia, there was another group of nomads which gave the Chinese civilization on the eastern side quite a difficult time, and they also came from the steppes. Just take us through that bit, Arif.
Yes, these people were known as the Xiongnu, and they were in effect the eastern counterpart of the Scythians. The center of the Xiongnu Empire, it looks like it was in Mongolia, and for more than 2 centuries, the Xiongnu, they were constantly warring with China, which remained the major force in the eastern areas of Central Asia. However, by 48 CE, the Xiongnu Empire was mainly plagued by internecine, lots of struggles, internal struggles, and it started to dissolve. Some historians have suggested that there was a link between the Xiongnu and the Huns in the west, that later they gave the Romans a very hard time. And just like the later day Turks and Mongols, the Huns inspired unparalleled fear throughout Europe. They were very, very accurate mounted archers, and they had a complete command of horsemanship. And their charges and unpredictable retreats and the speed of their strategical movements brought them overwhelming military victories. So the first time that we really hear about the Turks was through Chinese historians in 552 CE, but obviously they have origins that go much further back than this. But around that time, the Mongolian plains, they were ruled by the Yuan Empire, also known as Ororan, Khange, and the Avars. And the tribe of the Turks living within the Yuan Empire specialized in metallurgy, revolted and seized power. And they managed to establish their first Turkish empire, which was known as the Göktürk Empire, and that for about 2 centuries that remained the dominant force in Asia. Just for information, the name Gok derives from celestial or blue sky Turks, and this empire was very often known as the blue sky Turks.
It's interesting. Those who watch the Turkish drama series will have heard that term, the blue sky Turks, in Ertugrul and now Osman, but they take great pride in that particular name and their earlier origins. The founder of the Turk Empire was called Bumin, and he actually was the one who bore the title of the Khagan, because this comes in later on during the Turkish tribes and the Mongols as well. The term and the Great Khan also was derived from that as well. So when he took over the Turk from the Yuan, he died very soon afterwards, and the empire was split into 2. Originally, he had split it between his reign in the eastern side and the western side with his brother. And that basically became an official split with his sons as well. So the western part was ruled by Bumin's brother Ishtemi, I think it was in 553 CE. Then, of course, that was the first major Turk empire. And at this stage, they were not really Muslims or anything. The Great Turks became Muslims, and we'll talk about that later. The Göktürk Turks were replaced by the Uyghurs, and it's a name you hear currently with what's going on in China, and their origins go back to 744 in terms of having a big empire in that area. They gave the Chinese quite a hard time. But we're going to leave that side of the nomadic tribes and move really more to the Turks. And the Oghuz, again, another term you hear a lot in the Turkish dramas. So, Amir, if you could take us through a little bit of their importance, how they link to the Great Oghuz Turks and the Oghuz State and the role it played.
So we're going to see now a whole series of different tribes and dynasties coming through now that was formed the basis of the Ottoman Empire. And the Oghuz State existed from 766 to 1055, and it was founded by Oghuz Turks in 766, located in the area between the Caspian and Aral Seas. So this was a widespread series of different tribes and clans, not just in one particular place. And around this period, the Turkic tribes were beginning to have a major interaction with the wider Islamic civilization. And this is where we see Islam coming into these different cultures as it expanded towards the Eurasian steppes from the Middle East. Now, the use of slaves, or Mamluks, which is the Arabic term for a non-Muslim slave, was a major component of Muslim armies. And this became a distinct feature of the Islamic civilization over many years, continuing even into the 9th century. And the practice was actually started in Baghdad by the great Abbasid Khalif al-Mu'tasim, and it soon spread throughout the Muslim world. So this was the sort of origins of many parts of also not just the Turkish Empire, but Islamic civilizations as well. So many Turkic tribes were recruited into the army as Mamluk slaves, and with time they not only converted to Islam, but they also gained important positions in the army. And that sort of formed the basis of their influence there. And this continued with the weakening of the Abbasid Caliphate and the emergence of empires like the Samanid Empire, which was a prominent Sunni empire from that part of the world that lasted from 819 to 999, which was centered around Khorasan and Transoxania. And at its greatest extent, this empire encompassed many parts of what we now know today as Afghanistan, large parts of Iran, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, all of these, what we might call the Russian steppe countries, the stans now, including Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, etc., Kazakhstan, and even extending as far as Pakistan. And we can see some of that evidence, I believe, still in the historical regions in Pakistan as well, where many cultures passed through. The key thing here is that there were two military families which arose from these Turkic slave guards based around the Samanid Empire, which were the Simjurids and the Gaznavids. And they ultimately proved disastrous to the Samanids, actually. And we can then start to see some key figures turning up and some of the words that we've heard about in some of these dramas. Two Samanid generals come to mind, Alptigin and Abu al-Hasan Simjuri. They competed for the governorship of Khorasan in Persia, and they sought to control the Samanid Empire as well, so that they could dominate that region after the death of Abdul Malik in 961. So we're starting to see this story play out, and I think that story becomes even more interesting as we start talking about some of the Turkic tribes.
So this is really where the real rise of Turkic influence on a global front starts, with the continuous flow of Turkic tribes and conversion to Islam in the Muslim lands. The power of the Turkic slave generals grew, and a desire for mastery of the throne with the help of shifting allegiance from the court's ministerial leaders both demonstrated and accelerated the Samanid decline. The Samanid Empire was replaced by the Gaznavid Empire, you mentioned, Amir, and its founder was also a Turk. His name was Sabutigin, as I remember, who was the son-in-law of the general you mentioned, Alptigin. But really, they gave to the Gaznavid dynasty, and that Gaznavid dynasty is well known. And just take us through a little bit about that
absolutely.
dynasty.
So that may be well known to our listeners, actually, because it's a prominent dynasty in that part of the world, and mentioned in many different cultures. And referred to. And it was really a Persianized Muslim dynasty of Turkic Mamluk origin. So we've already mentioned that. So now we can see this thread, this DNA, if you like, of Mamluks, Turks, Persians coming through these different empires. And at their greatest extent, the Gaznavid dynasty ruled essentially large parts of Iran and Afghanistan, also Transoxania and the northwest Indian subcontinent. You might say even up to northwest frontier province of Pakistan as well. It's not unusual or inconsequential to think that happened. And that lasted between 977 to 1186. So one of the sons of Sabutigin, Mahmud of Ghazni, actually he expanded the empire, the Gaznavid Empire, to its greatest extent from Amu Darya, the Indus River, and the Indian Ocean in the east, and to Ray and Hamadan in the west. So the story still continues. There is this inbuilt desire to build these empires to be expansive. They're always spreading out. They're never located in one region. And even during Mahmud's reign, which was from 997 to 1030, the Ghaznavids settled 4,000 Turkmen families near Farana in Khorasan. So again, this is idea of migration and settlement is always going on. Mahmud also regularly plundered India through raids, and the wealth brought back from Mahmud's Indian expeditions to Ghazni and the empire was enormous and sort of planted the seeds there for a very long reign.
As you said, these nomadic tribes were fierce warriors, and it went back to thousands of years. And these dynasties and empires, and especially the Muslims, they recruited these Turk tribes, but at a price, as we've seen already and beginning to see, and we will see. But this also led to the rise of probably before the Ottomans, the greatest Turk group. That's the Seljuk Turks. So Arif, if you can take us through really the rise of the Seljuk is, I assume, the founder, but just take us through the rise of the Seljuk Turks.
Yes, absolutely, Dr. Saab. As with most empires, there's usually a dispute along the way. So what happened here is Seljuk, who was the leader of the Seljuk clan, he had a falling out with the Ottoman State chief. And so he split off his clan from the bulk of the Oghuz, and he set up a camp on the west bank of the lower Darya. That was around 1985. He had already converted to Islam at that point as well, so he was a Muslim. According to the historians, the Ozghuz Turks, they'd settled mainly in Transaxonia, which is between the Caspian and the Aral Seas, and this was during the period of the Caliph Ahmad al-Mahdi after 775 AD. So by 780 AD, the eastern parts of the Sirdarya were ruled by the Seljuk Turks, and to the west was the Oghuz. As I said, Transaxonia, their main homeland, in subsequent centuries, this became known as the Ozghuz Steppe. So the actual Seljuk Empire was actually founded by two brothers. This is Turgurul Beg and his brother Charig Beg in 1037. They were the grandsons of Seljuk Beg. The Seljuks had migrated from their ancestral homelands into mainland Persia, into the province of Khorasan, where they encountered the Gaznavid Empire. Now, initially, the Seljuks were repulsed. They were fought back by Mahmud of Ghaznavi, and they retired to Khwarazm. But the two brothers then led them to capture towns of Merv and Nisharpur in 1037. After that, they repeatedly raided and traded territory with his successors across Khorasan and Balkh, and they even sacked Ghazni in 1037. In 1040, at the Battle of Dan-Nakan, they decisively defeated Masood I of the Ghaznavids and forced him to abandon most of his western territories to the Seljuks. Obviously, they kept up the momentum. By 1048 to 1049, the Seljuk Turks, they made their first incursion into the Byzantine frontier region of Iberia in Asia Minor, and they clashed with a combined Byzantine-Georgian army of 50,000 people at the Battle of Kaputro on 10th of September 1048. Now, the devastation left behind in this raid was so fearful. One of the historians has described this, that they left the lands as foul and unimaginable, inhabited by snakes, scorpions, and wild beasts. And it was reported that they brought back 100,000 captives and a vast booty loaded on the backs of 10,000 camels. So it gives you the size of the sheer scale of how much they'd captured, how much they'd won, and the spoils of the war. By 1055, Tughril, he'd captured Baghdad from the Shia Budids under a commission from the Abbasids. And the Caliph of Baghdad was so impressed with their strength and their skill that he made their leader, Tughril Bey, his deputy, and conferred on him the title of King of the East and the West. Now, the Seljuks actually, they assumed they were not happy with this. They were actually assumed that they were the rightful owners of all of the land conquered during the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and they were keen to extend their kingdom. So a contingent of around 5,000 of them moved into eastern Anatolia, and they left their mark there for some time as well.
So these were really the two founders, these grandsons of Seljuk Bey. But the Turk who's really most well known with the Seljuks and who set the empire on the great footing that we will continue to discuss was Alpacillon. Alpacillon was the son of Chagri Bey, and he expanded significantly upon Tugril's holdings by adding Armenia and Georgia in 1064 CE and invading the Byzantine Empire in 1068, from which he annexed almost all of Anatolia. And this really awakened most of Europe and the Pope and everybody else, and we were going to come to that. But just take us through the important. Perhaps we will get Amir to talk on that. But just to set the scene, because Alpacillon, when he started his rule, his aim wasn't to really attack Byzantine lands. He was more interested in sorting out the Fatimids in Egypt, because the Muslim empires basically had fragmented into different dynasties, and the Fatimids were a major dynasty. We were Shias at that stage, and the Seljuks saw themselves as the champions of Sunni Islam, and so he really wanted to sort out the Fatimids and go to war with them. It set off with a major army to challenge the Fatimids, having agreed with the Byzantines a peace treaty, and unfortunately in 1071 the Byzantine Emperor Ramanos the Fourth Diogenes sent envoys to Alpacillon to renew the treaty, but behind the scenes he was planning to break the treaty and attack and destroy the Seljuk Turks once and for all. So this really led to the biggest and most important historic battles between the Seljuk Turks and the Byzantines, and which raised the ire of the European Christians. The Battle of Manzikert is a pretty important battle. Even the current Turks, see that a central part of their history. Ahmed, do you want to take us through how this battle shaped up and what was the outcome of it?
Absolutely. So, as you can imagine, the Byzantine army was, a formidable army in its own right, but a raid against the Seljuk army was going to be an interesting outcome if ever there was one.
I think, as I remember, it was Ramanos had gathered over 40,000 army with mixture of Byzantines and at that time what we call East European, and Alpacillon had about 20 to 30,000 in his contingent. Right. But go on, carry on.
Yeah, so there was this ratio effect, I guess, almost 2 to 1 of the opposing force from the Byzantine army. And the Byzantine army, they tried to engage with the Seljuks, but Alpacillon employed his hereditary, if you like, tactic of hit and run, which was normal for tribesmen. These horse cultures, again, let's bring them back into the picture here. Hit and run, a tactic of steppe warriors, thus demoralizing and breaking up the Byzantine unit. So that was a successful tactic. He also sent spies to Turkic mercenaries fighting alongside Ramanos to desert, and this dwindled the Byzantine army. So a very clever, enterprising approach, and we were talking about this, in fact, before we started the session, about how different cultures can be enterprising, and this was certainly an approach that the Turkic army took. So Alpacillon summoned his army and delivered a speech on the day of the main battle on 26th August 1071, appearing in a white robe similar to an Islamic funeral shroud in the morning of the battle. Now this was largely deliberate, but also was a show of strength, showing to his men and to his army that he was ready to die in battle for the cause. Now that's an important point there, because this was literally a battle of empires. So let's not forget that. And this is the foundation stone again of these great empires and cultures in this part of the world. So Alpacillon actually achieved a decisive victory at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071 against quite formidable odds. And when the Emperor Romanus IV was captured and brought to him, to Alpacillon, the Sultan refused to believe that bloodied and tattered man in front of him was the mighty emperor of the Romans. How can this be? But that's what happened. And so a famous conversation is reported to have happened and taken place, with Alpacillon saying, "So what would you do if I were brought before you as a prisoner?" So he was saying this to the emperor. And Romanos replied, "Well, perhaps I'd kill you or exhibit you on the streets of Constantinople," which we now know in Istanbul today, of course. To which Alpacillon replied, "Well, my punishment is far heavier. If I forgive you and if I set you free, then that is your punishment." And of course, no one wanted to have that sort of punishment placed before them. So Alpacillon, by saying that and in the way he treated Romanus with considerable kindness, and again offered him the terms of peace that he had offered prior to the battle, which, as we know from Islamic history, was a hallmark of what we now can call chivalric behaviors and compassion, even in the height of battle towards fellow peoples.
I mean, Alpacillon was a true lion, and the name Aslan, I think, Arif, you've read more books than I have on English culture, but what's that? Witch and the
Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, C.S. Lewis.
The lion, isn't it?
Aslan, but
Aslan,
a variation of Aslan.
I think there's a copy there, But anyway, this battle, as you said, was very, very important. The fallout from Manzikert was disastrous for the Byzantines, resulting in civil conflicts. In fact, Romanos went back, and after a while a revolt came about, and he was killed by his own people, which is interesting. And they had, various other civil conflicts and economic crises that weakened the Byzantine Empire and to defend their borders. Now, this led to the mass movement of Turks into central Anatolia. Of course, they were victorious and they were on a high. So by 1080, an area of 78,000 square kilometers had been gained by the Seljuk Turks. And it took 3 decades of internal strife before Alexis I restored stability to Byzantium. Historian Thomas Asbridge says, and I'll quote he says, "In 1071, the Seljuks crushed an imperial army at the Battle of Manzikert in Eastern Asia Minor. And though historians no longer consider this to have been an utterly cataclysmic reversal for the Greeks, it still was a stinging setback. It was the first time in history a Byzantine emperor had become the prisoner of a Muslim commander." And Alpacillon, of course, authorized these Turkmen generals to carve out principalities in Anatolia, and a number of atabegs were set up, which will include some important atabegs which we're going to consider later on. I think probably this is a good time to have a break, and then we'll come back in the second part and carry on. You've been listening to the Voice of Islam Living History program.
You're listening to the Voice of Islam Radio, broadcasting on DAB and via the internet 24 hours a day.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to part 2 of the rise of the Turks in the great Seljuk Empire. Before we had the break, we just talked about the Seljuk Turks, how they arose, and the greatest Seljuk Turk of all, I suppose, Alpacillon. But he, of course, was followed by another great Seljuk Turk leader, Malik Shah, the first Arif. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more about who Malik Shah was and what he achieved.
Yes, of course, Dr. Saab. Malik Shah was Alpacillon's successor, and there was great expansion in his time. So he had an advisor, a Persian advisor, Nizam al-Mulk, and during this time, the Seljuk state expanded in various directions, not just in one area. So it reached to the former Iranian border of the days before the Arab invasion, and it soon bordered China in the east and the Byzantines in the west. He even moved the capital from Ray to Isfahan, and it was during his reign that the great Seljuk Empire reached its zenith, its most powerful. Just some of the other examples of what he established: the Nizamiyab University at Baghdad. This was established by Nizam al-Mulk in 1065, and this reign of Malik Shah was reckoned to be the golden age of the great Seljuk. Even the Abbasid Caliph titled him as the Sultan of the East and the West, as we mentioned before, in 1087. In 1091, Nizam al-Mulk appointed a 33-year-old Al-Ghazi as professor.
Al-Ghazali, yeah?
Al-Ghazali, sorry, as professor of the Nizam University. And this offered free education, and it had been described as the largest university of the medieval world. Malik Shah, unfortunately, he was assassinated in 1092, and this started again a split amongst the empire and a large period of decline, as his brother and his 4 sons, they quarrelled over apportioning and splitting up of the empire amongst themselves. So Malik Shah, he was actually succeeded in Anatolia by Hildij Arslan I, and he founded the Sultanate of Rum. And in Syria, he was succeeded by his brother Tutush I. In Persia, he was succeeded by his son Mahmud I, and his reign was actually contested by his other 3 brothers, Barakuk in Iraq, Muhammad I in Baghdad, and Ahmad Sajjah in Khorasan. So you see again, as very common, once a particular person dies, the successors often fight amongst themselves, and unfortunately that was the case here as well.
We've concentrated quite a bit on some great individuals and the expansion of the empire, but one must not forget that during this time of expansion and relative stability, some great Muslim thinkers and scholars arose, including Rumi. And you mentioned Al-Ghazali was around again, such a prominent figure in the Muslim world. And Nizam al-Mulk's contribution to the understanding of politics and the running affairs will make House of Cards, put it in place as well. But these were the great Seljuk rulers, really, and after them, the empire started weakening with the sons and grandsons, etc. And an important figure arises in 1094. And that was the figure of Tutush, the Atabeg. Atabeg basically is a governor. It's just the title given in those days of Damascus, who happened to be a relative of the Seljuk Sultan, and he accused another important Atabeg, Aksankar, the Atabeg of Aleppo, of treason against the Seljuk Empire and had him arrested. Now, I raise this because Aksankar had a son who became a very, very prominent Muslim figure amongst the Turks. In Damascus, Aksankar was executed in 1094 under the orders of Tutush. And another Atabeg and a powerful warrior, Turkish, Karboga, who was the Atabeg of Mosul in current-day Iraq, took pity on the 10-year-old son of Aksankar, and that child's name was Imaduddin Zengi, and brought him up as his child. Now, this was no ordinary child, as I said. Zengi would turn out in the future to be the savior of the Muslim world, and that's an understatement, I suppose. Just to say that the Seljuk Turks really rattled Europe and the Pope and the Christian powers. The Pope and many noblemen in Western Europe had become alarmed by the successes of the Seljuks, especially with the inroads they were making against the Byzantine in Anatolia. This led to the launching of the Crusades against the Muslims. Given that there was now a considerable disunity in the Muslim world from a European point of view, the timing was probably just right. During the First Crusade, the fractured states of the Seljuks were generally more concerned with consolidating their own territories and gaining control of their neighbors than with cooperating against the Crusaders. So just take us through now the build-up of the Crusades, Amir, and the Seljuks and the other powers that existed.
Of course. So now we move into a period of history which was very assuredly bloody by all respects. And, we have to thank God, literally, that we are not living in that time. It was a very, very barbaric time and a period of great, threat to all peoples in both the East and West. These were, times of conquest and times of great wars and battles. So the Seljuks at that time easily defeated the First Crusade in 1096, but they couldn't stop the progress of the army of the subsequent Prince's Crusade, which took important cities. And now I'm going to mention several very important names and battles which took place over time. So places such as in Nicaea, Iznik, Iconium, which is present-day Ikonia in Turkey, Caesarea Masca, which is Caesarea, and of course Antioch, Antakya, which was all these cities and places, battles, locations. They were on the way to, of course, to Jerusalem, Al-Quds. So this was, like a holy road of battle and of conquest, as I mentioned as well. And in 1099, the Crusaders finally captured the Holy Land and set up the first Crusader states, which paved the way for many of the subsequent Crusades, as we know. And the Seljuks, they had already lost Palestine to the Fatimids, and we know the history, as we've Dr. Saab discussed earlier on, the infighting between the different factions that was carrying on for such a long time. And the Fatimids had taken this land, and they just had it recaptured just before the Crusaders came along and took it. So there's this constant toing and froing of land, infighting that's going on that makes this picture quite complicated. And at the same time, another group of Turkic warriors who were the descendants of Artuk Bey, the Artukids, and they ruled over the plains of Jazira with their capital at Mardin. And Artuk Bey was one of the great Seljuk commanders under Alpacillon, and he had two sons, Sokimand and Ilghazi, who themselves became great heroes in the Muslim world, as you might know. So Ilghazi, for example, he had distinguished himself in the army of the Seljuk army under Bakirug, the ruler Bakirug, but he had migrated back to his homeland just before Sultan Mohammed unified the Seljuk Empire. Sokiman, meanwhile, had gained prestige by crushing the Crusaders at the Battle of Haran in 1104 AD. That's one of the key battles in the Crusade history of the Crusades, which is just outside Edessa. So at the Battle of Haran, this victory was only possible with the help of the Jikamish, who was a successor to Koboga and was a fierce warrior who had also stood with Koboga. And during this battle, Jikamish was also accompanied by Koboga's disciple, who was the 19-year-old Imad ad-Din Zengi. Now, we've heard that name before, of course. So some of these names are recurrent and their bloodlines are recurrent as well. And the Battle of Haran ranks as one of the biggest defeats for the Crusaders after the battles were to follow, such as the Fields of Blood in 1119, and one of the most infamous battles known throughout the Muslim world in history is the Battle of Hattin, where, of course,
this was Saladin's great moment.
Yes, I'm trying to remember his full name, Saladin al-Ayyubi. He was born in Iraq, actually, as it happened, but then actually took his armies towards the Crusaders. And the Battle of Hattin, otherwise known as the Battle, the Horns of Hattin, because of the strategic importance of that battle, in 1187 was another key landmark battle during that period of time. So having lost most of the army, the county of Edessa, for example, was left for the next 40 years as nothing more than having sort of a client status to its powerful neighbor in Antioch. And of course there was subsequent battles that followed that. So complex time.
Yeah, it was a difficult time for the Muslims, being fragmented as well, but you could see some great figures coming through to really give a moral boost to the army. Now, after the defeat and death of the Seljuk Sultan by the Crusaders in 1118, Al-Ghazi, as the leader of the Atakids, really took the decision to attack the forces of the Crusaders and take the important city of Aleppo. At this battle, you mentioned the fields of blood. And this greatly boosted Al-Ghazi's reputation in the Muslim. Al-Ghazi had been a well-respected and highly feared leader from about 1107 until his death in 1122. And he had created a very disciplined Turkish group of warriors who had restored some pride in the Muslim lands, because when the Crusaders came and took over the Holy Land, they absolutely crushed the Muslims on the way. And as you said, the Fatimids actually had ruled the Holy Land at that stage. So Al-Ghazi and the sort of Turk warriors played a big part in reawakening that pride in the Muslims. The task, of course, of restoring full pride was for another Turkish commander, which we'll come to. The great Turkic warrior and strategist Imad al-Zengi is the name that comes to mind, and his reign was 1127 to 1144, and we mentioned how he grew up and how Kaboga had actually taken him under his wings. He came to power in 1127 to become the Atabeg of Mosul. And the Muslim world was about to now witness a rare event in their fortune. Zengi was highly respected and feared by his army, and he was ruthless in instilling discipline. And just Arif, take us through really what he achieved, because Saladin gets a great write-up for achieving what he did. But I think Zengi set the scene for that resurgence.
Absolutely, Dr. Sab. So Zengi had gained the trust and support of the Seljuk Sultan Mahmud II. And he'd come to the aid of the Sultan many times. However, when the Sultan died in 1131, Zengi only paid lip service to the Caliph and the new Sultan. In 1139, he attacked Damascus because Damascus had allied itself to the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem. In that attack, he took the fortress in Belbek, and he gave the captured territory around Damascus to one of his Kurdish generals, known as Najm ad-Din Ayyubi. He was a relatively obscure and unknown figure, but would later give a name to a very important dynasty to rule Muslim lands. And he was the father of An-Nasir Salahuddin Yusuf ibn Ayyub, more popularly known as Saladin, who was the founder of the Ayyubid dynasty and the unifier of the Muslim world. By 1144, Zengi had decided, he'd become emboldened, and obviously he knew his strengths, and so he decided to attack.
He was a great strategist, wasn't he?
Absolutely.
He really was.
You could see that there was some method to what he was doing and progression. So by 1144, he decided to attack the weakest link of the Crusader states, which happened to be the county of Edessa, as previously mentioned. This had been attacked regularly by Muslim forces, although the Battle of Haran in 1104 was still the biggest blow that had been given to Edessa. Upon arrival, Zengi built great siege engines, and given the defenders of Edessa did not have much experience of siege warfare, they were soon defeated by a highly disciplined army who entered the city on the 24th of December 1144. Now Zengi again showed some mercy. He gave orders for the native Eastern Christians to be freed, but he was ruthless with all of those who had come as crusaders from Europe. So 2 days later, on the 26th of December, he gave charge of the city to one of his commanders. And after an existence of 46 years under Crusader rule, the county of Edessa was no more. And overnight, Zengi had become a legend in the Muslim world, and he and his successors became a rallying point for all resistance against the Crusaders.
Now, by the end of January 1145, the army of Jerusalem came to defend against Zengi, and as he had to return to Mosul to regain order after some trouble, his fame, of course, continued to increase. He earned the title of Al-Malik al-Mansur, which means the victorious king and the defender of the faith. And that's a big title in the Muslim world for Zengi. Just like the Byzantine call for aid against the Seljuks was the trigger for the First Crusade, the fall of Edessa triggered the launch of the Second Crusade. And by the time the Second Crusade got to the Holy Land, Zengi had died, unfortunately murdered by one of his slaves in 1146. In Mosul, he was succeeded by his eldest son, Saifuddin Ghazi I, and in Aleppo by his younger and more famous son, Nuruddin. The Gaznavid Empire would become a major force under Nuruddin, ably supported by his exceptionally talented general Saladin, which Arif alluded to. And in 1174, unfortunately, Nuruddin suddenly died of a heart attack, and his 11-year-old son was too young to fill the void, so Saladin took over. And in 1187, Saladin sent a message for a jihad or a war of liberation, and he gathered a massive army of 30,000 fighters. The Battle of Fatin, which is probably the most famous Muslim battle against the Crusaders, is one of the most important battles for the world of Islam, and Saladin achieved a famous victory on the 4th of July, 1187. And then after a brief siege, Jerusalem was taken by Saladin on the 2nd of October, 1187. Saladin proved to be a magnanimous conqueror. Now, he was, as you say, from Iraq and Iraq, and I think he was a Kurd by origins. So not a Turk, but he wouldn't have come onto the scene had it not been for the Turkish warriors who'd set the scene for him. So, Amir, little summary on the Seljuks, really, before we move to some of the other things. They had some notable achievements, the Seljuks, over their time, before we look at other dynasties.
Yes, absolutely. So as we've seen and we've heard from all of us this afternoon, there's been this tremendous mixing and interweaving of empires, of conflicts, battles, successes, maybe even some failures along the way, but certainly progress overall. And I think the thing about the Seljuk Empire was that they created and produced some really quite exceptional things for the period of history we're talking about. You know, they were educated in the service of Muslim courts as slaves or mercenaries. That's where they came from. But they did actually bring revival, energy, and reunion to the Islamic world. Let's not forget that, which had hitherto just been dominated by Arabs and Persians alone. So as we've heard about their patronage of education, actually, and it wasn't just about fighting and conquest. You know, they founded universities. They were patrons of art and literature as well. You know, when I mention some names now, you'll realize how much they had affected and actually impacted and influenced the world. Their reign is really characterized by eminent individuals, Persian astronomers such as Umar Khayyam, the Persian philosopher Al-Ghazali. You know, they've got some really historical major figures in history here, and that was within the context of the Seljuk Empire. So under the Seljuks, Persian became a language for historical recording, for poetry, but also for science as well. And the center for Arabic language culture shifted from Baghdad to Cairo as well. And so for a brief period of time, you had other sultans and rulers that became more prominent. For example, Togrul III, he was a sultan of all of the Seljuk Empire except for Anatolia. And in 1194, you may have heard of another name we've talked about already. Togrul was defeated by Takash, who was the Shah of the Khwarezmid Empire. So now we're seeing the rising of another empire coming alongside the Seljuk Empire. And the Seljuk Empire finally collapsed. And from that former Seljuk Empire, only the Sultanate of Rum in Anatolia remained. So as this dynasty declined in the middle of the 13th century, the Mongols appeared on the scene, perhaps once again emerging from the eastern steppes, and they emerged to invade Anatolia in the 1260s and divided it into small emirates called the Anatolian Beyliks. And eventually one of these, the Ottoman, would rise to power and eventually conquer the rest.
Over the next few minutes that we have in the program, we'll go through some of the major dynasties of Turkic origins. And because some of them we've covered in previous programs as well, so I might cut you short possibly. But you mentioned the Khwarezmian dynasty. That was a Persian Sunni Muslim dynasty of Turkic Mamluk origin. The dynasty ruled large parts of Central Asia and Iran in approximately a period of 1077 to 1231. And first as vassals of the Seljuks, and then really carved out a nice empire. And they are sadly met a terrible end at the hands of the Mongols, and we've covered that in the programs of the Mongols, Arif as well. And then, of course, there were a number of other Turkic principalities, and one of the important ones around the sort of western steps towards the Russian side. This is where Islam had interaction with these people as well. And the Cuman-Kipchak Confederation really provided a lot of slaves, which were called Mamluks as well. And there was a very, very important Mamluk slave. We've done a whole program on him, but just take us a little bit about the importance of the Cumans and Kipchaks, Arif, as Turks.
Yes, so the Cumans and Kipchaks, they were fierce, formidable nomadic warriors of the Eurasian steppe, and they exerted an enduring influence on the medieval Balkans. They were numerous, culturally sophisticated, and militarily powerful. By the end of the 13th century, the Cuman-Kipchak Confederation, it had been conquered and absorbed into the Golden Horde, which is the westernmost division of the Mongol Empire. Around 1242, the Bali tribe fled the invading armies of the Mongols, and they arranged to settle in the Bulgarian Empire. A number of the Cuman Kipchak Turks were sold as slaves, including a young man who would be later become known as Baybars. And he was a future savior of the Muslim world against the onslaught of the Mongols and the Crusaders. Turkish-speaking slaves who had become the military backbone of most Islamic states, they were highly prized, and eventually Baybars came into possession of the Ayyubid Sultan al-Salih Najm al-Din Ayyub of Egypt. He was sent, like all Sultan newly acquired slaves, from military training to an island in the Nile. He demonstrated outstanding military abilities, and upon his graduation and emancipation, he was appointed commander of a group of the Sultan's bodyguard. He worked his way through the military ranks and eventually became a commander of the Mamluks military unit under the Ayyubids. And he rose to fame for his military prowess and bravery when the odds were against him. And I think we've covered this in one of our previous
Absolutely,
programs.
yeah. During this period, of course, the European nations once again became extremely agitated with the loss of Jerusalem second time. And they became convinced that the Sultanate of Egypt had to be defeated in order to recapture Jerusalem from the Muslims. With the Muslim world, including the Ayyubid dynasty, in turmoil, the Crusaders decided to strike back in 1244 at the Battle of Lefobi, a small village. Amir, just take us through, because this is another very, very important battle that really ended the longer-term Crusades, although not straight away, but just take us through that.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Egyptian army was led by Baybars, as you've heard, a very accomplished fighter, military strategist, and prominent figure of the time. And this would be one of the most important battles to decide the future control of Jerusalem. Far away, but near at hand, I guess you could say. This was important. And the Battle of Lefobi took place between October 17th, 1244, and October 18th. So the Christian army in this battle consisted of about 1,000 cavalry and 6,000 foot soldiers. And in support of this Crusader allied army, Al-Mansur from the Syrian Ayyubid faction, who was opposed to Ayyubids in Egypt, he provided about 2,000 troops from Syria himself and 2,000 Bedouin troops, which were provided by Transjordan. So the total numbers for the battle were around 11,000, thus outnumbering the army of Baybars. So again, looking at these figures, insurmountable odds. And the fighting was very fierce in this battle. And at the end of it, over 5,000 Crusaders had died and 800 prisoners were taken. including some prominent figures from Europe like Walter of Brienne. So the Syrian Ayyubid army and the Bedouins were annihilated as a result, with just a few hundred escaping. And this was a decisive victory for Baybars and his army, having lost very few troops, again pointing to his very astute judgment and also the expertise of the men under his command. And while the Battle of Hattin holds great symbolic importance as having led to the fall of Jerusalem, it was actually Lafourbi that truly marked the collapse of the Christian power in this part of the world. And so after this important battle, Baybars continued to play a prominent role, and he played a key role, in fact, in turning the tide on the Europeans during the Seventh Crusade, which was led by Louis IV of France, in the period 1248 to 1254. And according to medieval Muslim historians, 15 to 30,000 French fell on the battlefield, and thousands were taken prisoners during that particular crusade. So the numbers are staggering, but the events were also...
As Arif said, we've done a whole program on Sultan Baybars, so listeners can actually catch up in detail about his achievements. But just to say that throughout the campaign of Louis, the French king, he'd been decisively defeated, and there was great suffering and loss of morale amongst the crusading army. Shortly after the defeat of the Seventh Crusade, the Ayyubid Sultan Turan Shah was assassinated. And Arif, if you can just take us through that a little bit, how then...
Yes, so after this assassination, the Mamluks who defended Al-Mansura and prevented Louis IX from advancing to Cairo, they became the ruling power in Egypt, ending the Ayyubid rule in that country. While the Battle of Hattin in 1187 and the recapture of Jerusalem by Saladin holds great symbolic importance, it was actually Lafourbi and the crushing defeats suffered by Louis IX that truly marked the collapse of Christian power and the desire to launch campaigns against the Muslim hand.
So this was, and his contribution to the defeat of the Mongols, which we've covered in his previous programs, really the savior of Islam in many ways, which we consider. We're running out of time, and of course there was another great Mamluk dynasty, and that was the Delhi Sultanate, which was founded by Qutbuddin Aybak, a former Turkic Mamluk, and that dynasty, again, before the great Mughals of India, had ruled India for quite a long time, and the first queen from the Muslims as well, with Razia Sultan. So we could say a lot more on that, but unfortunately we're not going to have enough time to do justice to it. So perhaps we'll have to do another program. But just goes to show, really, the Turks played a big part in expanding Islam and Islamic empires. I think this has been a fascinating, quick journey through some of the Muslim empires, and in particular where it involved the Turks. I want to thank Amir and Arif for their contributions. Hope listeners have enjoyed listening to our program. Please do give us your feedback at Voice VI Living History, that's Voice of Islam Living History program. Do watch the other programs as well on the website www.voiceofislam.co.uk. So inshallah, until our next program, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.